World War I. In 1871, the sudden appearance of a powerful and ambitious new state added a new and destabilizing element to the other rivalries and tensions that divided the nations of Europe. The German Empire, as it was called, was, at the moment of its birth, one of the most powerful nations in Europe. By the end of the 19th century, Germany was the most powerful. It had the largest population of any European nation except Russia, and, by some measures, in steel production, for example, it was the greatest industrial power in Europe. It also had, by general admission, the best army in the world. Unsurprisingly, all the other leading nations in Europe, who spoke of themselves as the great powers, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire, France and Britain, were wary of her, but the Germans themselves also had major fears. German unification had come about in the aftermath of a crushing defeat of France, and the German government under Otto von Bismarck feared French revenge. It was right to do so. France had been badly humiliated in the brief war, and had lost some of its territory, the border region of Alsace-Lorraine, to Germany. The Germans knew that the French would never really rest until they had it back. What Bismarck was particularly afraid of was that France would join forces with the giant to the east, Russia, and encircle Germany. The Eastern Question. In Southeast Europe, a region known as the Balkans, the Turkish or Ottoman Empire had been in decline for a century or more. This process speeded up from the mid-19th century onwards, and as the Turkish Empire weakened, new European states emerged in the Balkans: Romania, Serbia, Albania, Montenegro, and Bulgaria. The Russian and Austro-Hungarian empires, the two great powers to the north of the Balkans, increasingly competed with one another for power and influence in this region. The sudden emergence of Germany as a leading European power gave the Austro-Hungarian Empire the opportunity to look to it as an ally against Russia, which, as noted above, Germany feared as a potential ally of France. In 1879, Germany and Austro-Hungary signed a treaty of mutual protection. They were joined by Italy, which had its own reasons to fear France, in 1882. The three states formed the Triple Alliance. Imperialism. By the early 1880s, therefore, not only had a new power suddenly appeared in Europe, but this power now stood at the heart of a three-nation alliance, which, although supposedly for mutual protection, made the other great powers, Russia, France and Britain, feel nervous. For these powers, however, the situation was not straightforward, as they were rivals for territories around the world. This was the heyday of European imperialism, and Britain and France were grabbing territory in Africa and Southeast Asia, whilst Britain and Russia were competing for territory and influence in Central Asia. To complicate matters for them, Germany and other countries wanted their own overseas empires. These imperialistic rivalries were gradually settled in the early 1880s, with the European nations dividing up much of the rest of the world into spheres of influence. This paved the way for France and Russia to form an alliance of their own, in 1904. For long, Britain was reluctant to entangle herself in continental alliances. The fact that she was an island, with the greatest empire the world had ever seen and protected by the most powerful navy in the world, meant that she had been more relaxed than the other great powers about the formation of the Triple Alliance. From the late 1890s, however, a new factor drove her into alliance with France and Russia. After 1898, the Germans began building a powerful navy of their own, made up of the most up-to-date warships in the world. This posed a direct challenge to Britain's naval power on which she depended for her security. The German policy set in motion a dramatic naval arms race between Britain and Germany. It also caused Britain to enter into alliance with Russia and France to form the Triple Entente in 1907. Tensions. The great powers of Europe were now divided into two rival camps, the Triple Alliance and the Triple Entente. Both had been formed to enhance the security of their member nations, although the different treaties varied in their details. All stipulated that, if a country was attacked by another, the other members of the alliance would come to her defense. The terms of both alliances stressed that the member nations had no obligation to come to the aid of a member which was pursuing an aggressive attack on another nation. Unfortunately, in many international quarrels which consist of a series of threats and counter-threats, it is unclear who is the aggressor and who the victim. It was inevitable, therefore, that the alliances would be tested by diplomatic incidents. A number of crises raised the international temperature. The naval arms race between Britain and Germany morphed into a general militarization of the European powers. Diplomatic crises. The first major crisis which brought the two alliances to the verge of war was the First Moroccan Crisis, 1905, when the French and the British, on the one hand, and Germany, on the other, clashed over the French occupation of that North African country. The sudden Austro-Hungarian occupation of Bosnia-Herzegovina, a small country in the Balkans, came next, 1908. It caused the Russians to mobilize in support of Serbia, which claimed Bosnia-Herzegovina as its own, and this in turn led the Austro-Hungarians to prepare for war. Germany and Britain only just managed to calm the situation down and prevent fighting from breaking out. The next crisis came in 1911 when France sent troops into Morocco to deal with some anti-European riots there. Germany demanded that the French make concessions to her, Germany, in order to continue with a free hand in that part of the world. International talks again averted war, but the level of tension and suspicion had been ratcheted up further. The Balkan Wars. A war in 1912 between the new Christian countries in the Balkans, on the one hand, and Turkey on the other resulted in Turkey losing practically all her European territory. However, the Balkan countries immediately started quarreling amongst themselves, with one side supported by Russia and the other by Austro-Hungary. A second war broke out, 1913, this time with most of the Balkan countries, including Turkey, fighting against Bulgaria. Bulgaria was heavily defeated. These two Balkan wars greatly increased anger and distrust within the Balkans, and again notched up tension between the great power alliances. Austro-Hungarian hopes of further southward expansion were now effectively blocked by a string of states supported by Russia. Furthermore, these pro-Russian states could meddle with ease in the affairs of the Balkan provinces of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. This they did, and World War I resulted. The Outbreak of War. 1914, Sarajevo. On June 28, 1914, an Austrian Archduke, Franz Ferdinand, and his wife Sophie were assassinated in Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia-Herzegovina. There was evidence that the Serbian government were at least aware of the plot, if not a party to it. Germany offered to support a furious Austro-Hungary in gaining compensation from Serbia. Thus fortified, the Austro-Hungarian government sent Serbia a list of demands which no government of an independent country could possibly agree to. They essentially demanded that Serbia give up its independence. The Serbian government requested that the Austro-Hungarian government modify these demands. This was refused. Russia began mobilizing its army and navy in support of Serbia, and Germany thereupon also began to mobilize. The Austro-Hungarian Empire declared war on Serbia on the July 28. Russia started mobilizing in support of Serbia on the July 30. Germany declared war on Russia on the August 1st, and on France on August 3rd. Britain declared war on Germany on August 4th, in support of its ally, France. Austro-Hungary declared war on Russia on August 6th. France and Britain declared war on Austro-Hungary on the 12th. World War I was underway. 1914, the German High Command considered Russia to be their main enemy. They assumed that it would take the Russians 6 weeks before they were fully mobilized. Following their well-developed Schlieffen plan, therefore, the Germans set about throwing most of their forces against the French to quickly knock them out of the war. Then they could turn against Russia. The German invasion of Belgium. Immediately on declaring war on France, Germany invaded Luxembourg, and 2 days later, Belgium. Working to the detailed timetable worked out beforehand, Britain at once began calling up volunteers. Hundreds of thousands of new recruits would soon be joining the army each month. By 1916, nearly 2 million men would have volunteered. Britain was also able to call on the support of the overseas territories of the British Empire. The self-governing dominions of Canada, Australia and New Zealand all declared war on the Central Powers when Britain did, and soon forces would be coming in from these countries, as well as from Britain's colonies in India, Africa, the West Indies and other territories. These forces would make an invaluable contribution to Britain's war effort, fighting under Britain's direction. In the summer of 1914, however, the country had to make do with what it had available at the time. It immediately sent an army, the British Expeditionary Force, to France. This was far smaller than any other belligerent army, and on hearing of its size, the German Kaiser is said to have called it a contemptible little army. It was still almost half the fighting strength of the entire British Army. The British Expeditionary Force, BEF, arrived in France on August 7 and took up its position on the northern flank of the French army, the Mediterranean. Although a member of the Triple Alliance with Germany and Austro-Hungary, Italy announced its intention of remaining neutral in the coming conflict. On the August 2 the Turkish government had entered into a secret alliance with Germany. It closed the Dardanelles, and hence the Black Sea, to Allied shipping on the 5th, thereby effectively isolating Russia from aid from its allies. The other main route between the Western Allies and Russia was through the Baltic, now tightly controlled by the German Navy. The Germans had two powerful battlecruisers near Italy, the Goeben and the Breslau. The British and French fleets were expecting these either to attack the French convoys ferrying Algerian troops to the war zones in France, or to head west into the Atlantic, to attack shipping there. In fact, the German ships headed for Istanbul, the capital of Turkey. Once there, to avoid Turkey breaching its neutrality at this time, the two powerful warships were officially transferred to the Turkish Navy. However, they retained their German officers and crew, and the German admiral became the commander-in-chief of the Turkish Navy. This maneuver was greeted with popular approval within Turkey, and helped shift Turkish sentiment decisively towards Germany. The two warships would play little part in the rest of the war, but their presence in the Black Sea prevented the Russian Navy from playing an important role in supporting the Russian campaign in the Caucasus. Lorraine. On August 14, the French army attacked the German forces in Lorraine. This was to fulfill one of France's main war objectives, the recovery of Alsace and Lorraine, regions historically part of France but occupied by the Germans back in 1871. The French invasion of Lorraine was quickly pushed back by German forces in the area. Russian invasions of Germany and Austro-Hungary. Meanwhile, in the east, the Russian mobilization had been completed within just 11 days, rather than the 6 weeks the Germans had been expecting. Germany's eastern borders were fairly lightly garrisoned, and two Russian armies invaded German territory. The German people were stung by the occupation of their territory by Russian armies, and the German High Command had no choice but to switch troops from the west to the east. The Russians also invaded Galicia, which belonged to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The main Austro-Hungarian army had invaded Serbia, in expectation of a quick victory. However, the Russians' unexpected invasion of their eastern frontiers forced the transfer of large numbers of troops to meet that threat. This left a much smaller army to continue the invasion of Serbia than had been planned. The Eastern Front. Tannenberg. The reinforced German army in eastern Germany met one of the two Russian armies which had invaded their country at Tannenberg on August 26. In the battle which followed, the Germans encircled the Russian army, and by the August 29 had killed, wounded or captured all but 10,000 of the original 150,000 Russian soldiers involved. The scale of the defeat was a huge blow to Russian morale. The Russian commander, Samsonov, committed suicide. Masurian Lakes. The Germans then marched on the second of the Russian armies in eastern Germany, and a second battle began on September 7, at the Masurian Lakes. This ended on the September 14 with a second Russian defeat. Although sustaining huge losses, 150,000 men against 40,000 Germans, the Russians were able to retreat in an orderly fashion, withdrawing from German territory back into Russian-ruled Poland. Warsaw. The Germans attempted to follow up their success and capture Warsaw. They were unsuccessful, due to the huge concentration of Russian troops in the area and the onset of bad weather, which made movement difficult. The Russians then attempted a second invasion of Germany, while the Germans tried again to capture Warsaw. These maneuvers led to the battle at Lodz, on 11th to 24th November, which was a draw. After this, the Russians abandoned any attempt to invade Germany again, and withdrew to a more defensible line in front of Warsaw, which the Germans had failed to capture. Lemberg. In Galicia, the southern sector of the Eastern Front, the confused situation in which Russian and Austro-Hungarian armies were operating in each other's territories began to resolve itself in a series of engagements, collectively known as the Battle of Lemberg. These started on August 23. After some initial successes, by September 11 the Austro-Hungarian army had been heavily defeated by the Russians. The Russians were then able to push the front well into Austro-Hungarian territory, in the Carpathian Mountains. They laid siege to the huge fortress of Przemysl. The Balkans. Austro-Hungarian and Serbian forces met at Ģeďar, August 20th. The Serbian forces succeeded in driving the Austrians back out of their country after nearly 10 days of fighting. The Serbian army, though ill-equipped, was made up of the battle-hardened veterans of two recent Balkan Wars, and this is what won them the day. However, in short order the Austro-Hungarian forces invade Serbia again. The sheer weight of Austro-Hungarian numbers drove the ill-equipped Serbs back from their lines towards Belgrade, their capital. On December 2 the Austro-Hungarian army entered the city. The Serbian army, however, was now able to rearm with some modern artillery and other equipment sent by its French and British allies. The Serbs then conducted a massive and highly successful counterattack against a section of the enemy. This exposed the Austro-Hungarian troops in Belgrade to the threat of encirclement, and their commander quickly gave the order to withdraw. The Austro-Hungarians hurried back all the way into their own territory. The two sides were back to where they had started, each having lost hundreds of thousands of men. The Austro-Hungarians were now forced to keep large numbers of troops on the Serbian front, thus weakening their efforts against Russia in the north. Turkey. Turkey joined the war on the side of the Central Powers, those fighting with Germany, on November 14. This was a blow to the Allies, those fighting with Britain and France, as it put the Suez Canal, the main communication artery between Britain and France on the one hand, and their colonies and economic interests in the east on the other, at grave risk. Troops from British India, Australia and New Zealand, and from French Indochina, came through the canal, as did oil from Persia to keep the Allied armies and navies moving. All this was now in jeopardy. At the end of 1914 British and Indian troops landed at Basra, on the Persian Gulf, to secure the oil fields in Iraq, vital to the Allied war effort. They advanced on Turkish forces defending Iraq, then known to the British as Mesopotamia. The Russians launched an offensive against the Turks in the Caucasus, however they soon found themselves threatened with encirclement by superior numbers, and had to retreat. The Turks were encouraged by this success to hope for massive territorial gains in that region, which they viewed as rightly theirs. They launched their own ambitious offensive, and the Battle of Cerakamis started in December 1914, in harsh winter conditions.